Now onto a story of a man who helped prevent the government from acting illegally and continues to be punished for it. Back in 2010, environmental activist Tim DeChristopher was protesting outside of an oil and gas lease auction for rural land in Utah. DeChristopher entered the auction and signed up as a bidder. Here's how he explained what happened next.
I started out bidding just to drive up the prices. And so I was being effective with that, but also still seeing that there was the opportunity to do more. That I had the potential to actually win those parcels and possibly create enough chaos that things would still be up in the air for the new administration, and that there was a chance that those parcels could be protected and that oil kept in the ground. You know, at the time I was thinking, if I do this, I'll probably go to prison for 2 or 3 years. Could I live with that? And I thought, yeah, it would suck really bad, but I could live with it.
Well, DeChristopher was arrested right after he won the auction, and here he talks a little bit about his trial.
One of the big developments has been a motion by the prosecution to limit my defense and to restrict me from using what's called the necessity defense, which is the argument that I was acting to prevent greater harm. The judge granted their motion, so now I'm not allowed to use that argument. And there's actually some question as to whether or not I'll even be able to inform the jury that this auction has been reversed because the government admitted that it was inappropriate in the first place.
Well, DeChristopher was sentenced to 2 years in prison and a $10,000 fine for violating the Federal Onshore Oil and Gas Leasing Reform Act and for making false statements. Well, now DeChristopher is in a halfway house in Salt Lake City, Utah, after serving 1.5 years in prison. Now, he is able to work, but when the Unitarian Church offered him a job, the Federal Bureau of Prisons denied DeChristopher that chance. Why? Well, because the Unitarian Church has a social justice bend, and DeChristopher was imprisoned for his social justice work. Seems a little strange and confusing. We would like to talk to DeChristopher himself, but as part of his sentence, he can't speak to the media without permission from the Bureau of Prisons. So instead, we're lucky enough to have his attorney, Patrick Shea. Hey there, Patrick. The Bureau of Prisons is not letting DeChristopher work for the Unitarian Church. What were their words when they denied him this opportunity?
Because the Unitarian Church is known for its social justice programs, and because Tim was serving a prison sentence for having acted on his sense of social justice, they thought it would be inconsistent with his parole aspirations.
So instead, he had to find another job, is that right? Was he able to find one?
He did. He found a wonderful job at Ken Saunders' Rare Bookstore. Ken Saunders is a distinguished Utahn who knew Edward Abbey and a whole bunch of different people who have been lifelong devotees of protecting the land in the West, and so there's a certain harmony, but he doesn't advertise social justice, so I think the Franz Kafka people in the Bureau of Prisons will be satisfied.
So, I mean, it sounds like a fun job, but it just seems interesting that working for a church, which, you know, tries to help society, is a place where somebody can't get a job for whatever reason. I know that when Tim described the trial in his own words, it seemed to defy logic in some ways, or at least didn't sound like a usual conception of justice. How would you characterize the trial?
I've practiced law for 36 years, and I would say in this instance, in my personal judgment, the end was determined before the trial actually began. There were more than 7 delays, so the idea of a speedy trial was not something that was part and parcel of the process. And given the strict limitations that the judge imposed on the defense counsel, Ron Yangage and Elizabeth Hunt and I don't believe that we were able to really speak to the jury in a way that we are entitled to. Now, judges are very strict in wanting to keep the jury focused on the facts in dispute and letting those individuals focus, the judge focus on the law. If you were back in the South in the 1960s, you wouldn't necessarily want the jury to be free to make up their own mind. But I think in the instance of climate justice, which Tim was talking about, there was a right for him to speak about his intentions, and the judge's ruling precluded that discussion.
Well, I was hoping, too, you could sort of straighten something out for me, because I was following this case as it was happening. And if I remember correctly, it happened, the auction happened under the presidency of George W. Bush. And after he left office, the law that was in place was no longer. So, you know, these people wouldn't have been able to drill on the land anyways afterwards. So it seems to me that what Tim did, yes, it might have prolonged things on a timing in the time frame, but talk a little bit about kind of the confusion here.
Yeah, part of it is I was the director of the Bureau of Land Management in the Clinton administration, so I'm very familiar with oil and gas auctions. And what was happening, again, in my judgment, is at the end of the Bush administration, they were pushing out as much public land for drilling for their friends in the oil and gas industry as possible. And it was reasonable to expect that the new administration was not going to be so lenient on putting out public lands. So Tim's actions went in and stopped the very end of that process as applied to public lands in Utah. It was what we call in politics a dinosaur egg, that it's something that the going out administration lays into the future, knowing that the new administration is not necessarily going to want to have to deal with it, but out of necessity they will. Secretary Salazar, as a former attorney general, wasn't particularly prone to be seen in his first few months in office as being lenient on a lawbreaker, a self-admitted lawbreaker, as Tim very honestly declared. And so nothing could be done other than allow the process to go forward. And it was a process in the instance of the red state of Utah, where the U.S. attorney had been appointed by Orrin Hatch, the judge had been appointed by Orrin Hatch, and there wasn't really an equal scale of justice, in my judgment.
Was there a precedent here to convict Mr. DeChristopher? I mean, has anyone else been in prison for not being able to back up a bid at a federal land auction?
No, there are 29 other bidders that just left. In some instances, they canceled the check. Sometimes they canceled the credit card. But none of them were prosecuted, and we were not allowed to mention those 29 bid walkers, is what the BLM calls them.
Interesting. Let's talk now about this ban on social justice activities. I mean, would that include working on environmental causes? Has the Bureau of Prisons explained exactly what DeChristopher isn't allowed to do?
Well, that's why I mentioned Franz Kafka. Like in the trial, nobody in the Bureau of Prisons has laid out for Tim clearly what he can or can't do. It's more, you go ahead and see what you can do, and then we'll review what you're proposing to do. And from my point of view, we're simply trying to get Tim out into the world. He will have a 3-year term of parole, but we're hoping that he will apply to the Harvard Divinity School, and that even the Bureau of Prisons will see that as a safe place.
We're almost out of time, Patrick, but how is Tim doing? Are his spirits okay?
His spirits are great. He took the GREs last week. Bill McKibben came by to see him at Ken Saunders' bookstore. Robert Kennedy is going to come by and see him on Friday. So there are a lot of people. If you're in Salt Lake, go by Ken Saunders and say hello to Tim DeChristopher. He really is a hero of this generation.
All right. Certainly a case that we've been following, and we appreciate your time. Attorney Patrick Shea, thanks so much.
Well, we appreciate you following it.
Absolutely.